So in regards to rituals, would you say that they are useless in one's life? Ritual.
Well, it depends on the purpose.
Or if you'd like to highlight your intentions, say towards enlightenment, intentions towards
of course,
renunciation.
Towards enlightenment, they're completely useless. But to say they're completely useless for an average person's life, that's not true either. In the sense that if there were no rituals, many people would have had no sense of routine, no sense of duty, or a certain repetition. And then rituals make them stick to it out of that kind of primordial anxiety and fear towards your existence. You turn towards rituals and at least you do them. Of course, it's fundamentally the wrong view. That's why if you were to use that as a vehicle to enlightenment, it's just impossible. It's actually an impediment. It's a fetter.
Like coming of age rituals that different societies have.
I think it's just symbolism and whatnot.
Or rituals towards like having a shrine.
Well, see, now you're coming into more specific type, and that's where you have to ask yourself why. I mean, cultural sort of rituals in the society are part of the culture. There's nothing to do with anything. That's just how it evolved. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you're having rituals in regard to your own shrine, you ask yourself why. Is it because you're not practicing towards the enlightenment? But then, what difference does it make if you're bowing to the shrine? What are you doing with it? Are you expecting something to happen to you, something to be given to you, blessings from something or someone through your idol worship? So for somebody who's practicing the Dhamma, there really is no room for any rituals. And if you keep maintaining the need of rituals in your life, to that extent you're not practicing towards the right view, because you're depending on this external magical belief. Because that's basically placing responsibility on the performance of ritual, as opposed to taking up responsibility yourself, in which case you feel it very differently. Because it's not about what you're meant to do, what the science have shown you to do. It's what you chose to do, which means any second you can choose otherwise, and you feel that edge. But that's just necessary. So if you're avoiding taking on that kind of weight of responsibility, that's when you sort of give in and put responsibility onto rituals, and to that extent you won't be practicing.
What about protocols of society?
Oh, they're just protocols. They're just empty motions you go through. They don't need to mean anything.
Can you disregard all the protocols?
Well, you have to be careful, because protocols and manners mean a lot to other people. So if you disregard it, you're going to be harassed on that account. Which is exactly why there's so many of those, smaller rules that are completely irrelevant towards the practice of Dhamma, but we still have them as monks, because they kind of originated organically, like with interactions with the society. But they have nothing to do with anything. It was just like the certain norms in the current society. They complain about certain things, and yeah, the Buddha could have sort of explained to them that it was completely wrong, and it's a wrong view, but it wouldn't have changed much, because people wouldn't have abandoned those views. So then when you look at it practically, it only resulted in monks being harassed and hassled on account of upsetting people, on account of some random stuff. That doesn't mean you don't draw a line when it comes to Dhamma, and you just go with whatever people want to hear. But certain things that are not impediment to the Dhamma either way. So whether you do it or not do it makes no difference to you practice the Dhamma, but makes the difference to the society you live in. Then you do what the society expects you, so you'll be left alone, so you can practice in peace. But of course, if the society demands you to get married or something, well, that's directly against the practice of Dhamma, so you just will never do that, even if the society is very upset. But if society demands you to wear shoes in town because they can't stand the sight of a barefoot person, that's fine, it makes no difference. And the only difference going to be is how much harassment you're going to get.
Because respecting your elders
Oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
For your parents.
Yeah. Well, that's a bit more, there is some meaning behind that. You should respect them, because without them you wouldn't be where you are. And in respecting elders in general, again, it maintains a certain standard of relationship with others that then others can learn from. If you start disregarding elders and teaching others to disregard the elders, then yeah, the values of respecting elders will be eroded. Doesn't mean you agree that elders always know the best for you, they even know the best for them. But in the terms of the way you would relate to another person, yeah, you respect their older. And same with monk seniority. Like according to the original Vinaya, seniority is just so that people will dwell in concord. So we don't all go at the same time and grab the pot with food and fight over who's going to serve first. No, certain order means certain harmony. But that's as far as it goes. It does not mean that somebody who's more senior has a say over you or has a say to tell you what to do and knows better, unless you took them as a teacher because you do see that they know more than you do. But in itself, as a kind of institutional order, that's it. It's on a very worldly level. Oh, you go first because you've been here longer. That's it. But doesn't mean that your vote or your say weighs more than mine because you've been here longer when it comes to Dhamma or to the Sangha matters. So that's often gets sort of blurred in between. So by default, by being more senior means you know more, or you certainly have more say over those who are not as senior. They must do what you tell them to do. That's simply not the case, unless they took on that relationship of a teacher, in which case a junior person can be a teacher if he's taken as a teacher by somebody else. So that's a completely different type of relationship. So when people rebel against seniority, that's usually what they rebel against. But they don't necessarily see that because the lines were blurred. They don't rebel they shouldn't be rebelling against just a norm of respecting elders and elders walking first and so on, or the ones who is more senior. But yeah, they should rebel elders sort of assuming wisdom just because they've been here longer and they assume that they know more than you do. But even against that, you don't have to rebel. You just pay no attention to it.
So if your parents aren't exactly the nicest of people...
Exactly, you respect them as your parents, but that doesn't necessarily mean you listen to them when they tell you what to do, because they genuinely don't have a clue. Or they might not have a clue. You don't dismiss it, but once you fully understood what you want to do, what you're doing, why it is good, and the parents are telling you the opposite, no, you should get married and have children and stuff, well, you realize that that's ignorant. That's just their craving and desire talking. But you don't disrespect them on account of it.
Yeah.
There's no need for disrespect.
What type of work should a person do, in your opinion? What is the best kind of work?
Again, who are we talking about?
For lay person, so no, the last time.
Oh, right. Well, any work that doesn't go against the 5 precepts.
And what would you say is the purpose of your work?
Oh well, just sustaining your life, and that's about it. So yeah. you find a certain balance between how much you want and how much you actually need, and then you work to meet your needs and maybe get extra just in case. But you don't work for the sake of gain that you can't even possibly practically benefit from, nor can you benefit others, which is when people just keep acting out of ideals of wealth and acquiring things. Well, like in reality, you can't even use it all up. So if you have family and children, yeah, that's of course something you have to work for to support them. But if you don't, it means you don't really have to work much if you lower your needs and live simply. So you have to keep your ambition in check and your cravings towards gain, towards access, towards luxury, towards comfort. All those things need to be paid for, which means you will need to work for all those things. But most people end up working for a lot more than they actually even want. But because they never stop and think about what they actually want, let alone what they really need, they just end up going with a craving towards more, and being very unhappy on account of it, because they didn't clarify where the line is for them. They didn't draw the line really.
Wisdom is the key.
Well, yeah, any form of self-reflection is a prerequisite for wisdom, for understanding, paired with wholesome, of course.
And because a lot of people want to work is suffering. You know,
Yeah, it is, sure.
working every day,
Yeah.
8 hours a day,
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, the most obvious example is when people start having families, pair up and have children and so on, and they don't really think it through. They just act out of desire to have children, desire of creating a family, but they ignore the weight of responsibility and the burden of work that's implied in it. Because if you have one child, you have to work for it. Two, you have to work even more. 3, 4 children means you have to work a lot. And that also means that if you don't have work, if you keep finding different work, it means you have to work for very little, because you don't have much leverage. You need work. You need any form of earning because you have 3 children to support. But again, you can't blame anybody else for that, because you created those children.
One shouldn't avoid.
Sorry?
One shouldn't avoid work.
No, of course not.
You
No.
shouldn't just
No. But one shouldn't be
a life of leisure.
Yeah, one shouldn't be ignorant in regard to it either. So that's what I mean. There is you must work for something. Well, even as monks, that's how often it was in the Suttas. Like the carpenters, they work with wood. The arrowsmiths, they make arrows, and the monks, they tame themselves. They practice restraint, and that's their work. That's where they get the food, and people give them offerings. So, in a way, it's like the most wholesome way of transaction, so to speak. People by making by giving, they make merit, and also they can learn Dhamma. But there is no fixed price, as in you have no wage. So sometimes you might not get anything, sometimes you might get too much. So you just sort of, but that's not your concern. Your concern is to do that work of a monk for yourself, not for the gain. If the gain comes to the extent of having your basic requisites covered, yeah, that's fine. If it comes more, you might share with other monks, that's fine. If none of that, that's also fine. So it's not that different when somebody works for a wage. Okay, I'll do this, you pay me this much. Just it's more wholesome in a way, because people will just donate, so to speak. You don't put a price on it. But the principle is the same. Whatever you do, you have to work to a degree or something. So the point is that most people in the world, not the monks, they don't think through what they want in their life, what they need in their life. So then they just end up, like everybody else, just going with the sensuality, with the sensual desires, and there is no end to amount of how much you will need when it comes to senses, because those desires are insatiable. So the more you want, the more you will need, basically. So that's why people don't think it through. Then of course I want to go out, I want to go on holiday, I want this, I want excitement, I want fun, I need money for it, so I must work a lot, I must work too much. But if you stop and think about, is it really worth it, working that much just for this fleeting excitement that you get through spending that money in sensual enjoyment? And probably about a good 2/3 of people would be quite happy if they scale back onto the amount of work they now must do. But in order to be able to scale back, they also have to then lower a bit of their desires and cravings in regard to sensuality, which is not a hard thing to do if you start thinking about it. But most people don't even think about it. And that's when most people end up being overworked and stressed, overly stressed, and generally not happy.
This is a sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. I'll just read out the first.
Go.
When it was said, a question about one, a concise statement about one, an explanation of one, with reference to what was it said. When a bhikkhu is completely disenchanted with one thing, completely dispassionate toward it, completely liberated from it, completely sees its delimitations and completely breaks through its meaning, in this very life he makes an end of suffering. What one thing? All beings exist through nutriment. So, understanding that.
Understanding the principle of dependence, the principle of depending on a nutrient.
Understanding the principle, yeah. As what Sankara.
Yeah, that's what Paticcasamuppada is, in the most concise understanding.
The second one says a question about two, a concise statement about two, an explanation of two. So the same thing, when he becomes completely disenchanted with these two things, he makes an end to suffering. That's name and form. And then the third one...
That's everything that appears.
Yeah.
It's name and form.
And the third one is what three is. Three kinds of feeling.
Right. So it's getting more specific, basically. Most fundamentally, understand the principle of Paticcasamuppada, the principle of nutriment, the principle of simultaneous dependence. With the presence of a nutriment, this is present. When nutriment is not there, this cannot be either. So that dependence of it. You don't necessarily go and investigate the content of the nutrient. You look at the principle of dependence upon the nutrient. So that is pretty much the most fundamental thing. Which is why the Buddha said the one who sees Paticcasamuppada sees the Dhamma, the one who sees the Dhamma sees Paticcasamuppada. Or maybe Sariputta said that. Doesn't matter. And then if you don't see it on that fundamental level, well, you can see it on another almost as equally fundamental, which is the name and form, the diet, the two. And that's everything that you can conceive of. It's within name and form. There's no outside of it. There's no behind it that you can also be aware of that does not partake in name and form. Whatever you can be aware, whatever you can be conscious of in the most remote, peripheral, ambiguous sense, it's within name and form. It's the name and form. Whatever has a nature to appear, no matter how subtly, it's the name and form. So if you understand the principle of appearance, as in the principle of the name and form of that diet, you've understood everything. If you experience dispassion towards it, disenchantment, as the Buddha describes it. Now, if you fail to see it on that level, well, you have another chance of, in regard to the three types of feelings, because that's another point of convergence, so to speak. It's on the level of how you feel. It's on the level of how you feel. That's where you crave. That's why you crave. That's how you crave. Through not understanding the feeling. So by understanding the principle of craving in regard to the three types of feeling, by experiencing dispassion in regard to the three types of feeling, disenchantment, you're completely free. All three things result in the same, obviously. It's just how the difference is how deeply understanding sort of contemplation pertains to. But it doesn't matter even if it's not to the most fundamental level, as long as the same principle of dispassion is developed in regard to the relevant things, that's all that matters.
The first one, all beings exist through nutriment, dependent on nutriment. So how do you practice that? How do you contemplate that? You just contemplate your existence is dependent on food?
Well, yeah, you can say that, but obviously you don't want to, as I said, you don't want to be just looking at the particular content of that nutriment. You want to be looking at the principle of dependence. So you can say, your life depends on eating food. Now there are many different things within that they can be standing for the same principle, such as having the healthy body that can still process and digest food, having your intestines working properly, having the right hormonal balance and everything else. Because if any of those things get messed up, you won't be able to be, well, the food won't be making much difference to you. Or you can be very healthy, but if there isn't a suitable food, same. So the nutrient, the principle of nutrient means depending upon something, you, in your core, depending upon something that is not yours, that cannot be yours. Like you can be accruing all the food you want, but you have no say over the like molecular operations of your organs, whether they're still healthy, whether they're still absorbing things correctly, or you're having some disease growing in you, or cancer that again, it's going to render the body useless, so no amount of good and healthy food will make you alive anymore. So that's what I mean. You have to discern the dependence in your core, not like explain it in a medical or scientific or psychological manner, saying yes, food results in this. No, see that this, you start with this, which is you are, the present experience as a whole. Within that, in its heart, there is a dependence upon things that are not in your control. That's in the heart of your very being. So you don't start by you don't start from the start. You have to reverse back into the correct understanding of what food is. So you don't start like food makes me this. No, you start with this depends on food. So it is the opposite direction. Because it's true, yeah, the food makes you alive, makes you healthy, makes everything, but that is not seen in that personal manner. You're not seeing the principle of that personal dependence. You're just explaining to yourself how sort of your body works when it comes to food and nutrients. But that's not the insight, that's an explanation. In order to see their dependence, you start with what you have, which is this body here. Whatever it is, healthy or partially healthy or sick, doesn't matter.
The center of the universe.
That is your center of the universe. That's your point of view. That's your situation. That's your world, as the Buddha said. There is no world outside of this body, less than 2 meters tall. That's it. The whole universe is contained within it. It's not in some metaphysical sense. It's just exactly, no matter how far you travel, it's through your body that you get to experience the world. So the body is your world. So you have to start with that, and then without abandoning that, without jumping back onto psychologizing or kind of explaining it, within your situation, of your body, of your present experience as such, you try to discern within that the dependence on the phenomenon of nutrient, of support, different than itself. That's the definition of a nutrient. You don't actually contemplate the food, cornflakes and bread. No, you just look at the principle of dependence. So that's the definition. That's why the nutriment, understanding the nutriment means understanding the principle of dependence. So this is your entire world. That's all you can ever have. You can't step outside of it. And you see that in its heart depend upon the whole domain of things that cannot be controlled by this domain of my body. So in that sense, you see that your whole life depends upon something else, that it's not in your control.
Which is not yours, not you.
Cannot be you.
Yeah.
Like you can be, as I said, you can be collecting and hoarding up all the food so you never go hungry, but that's aiming at a different level, at the wrong level. Because it doesn't matter how much you have or how much you don't have. What matters is that you cannot change the fact that you depend on it. That's the main point. So you can have all the food for the rest of your life, never to go hungry. That, again, that doesn't bring you any closer towards understanding the nature of depending upon food in the first place. Whether you have the food or not has nothing to do with it. It has to do with depending upon that which is not you, which cannot be you, which cannot be assimilated into you. And it's not incidental that eating sort of mirrors that principle of assimilation, of possession. Because you're trying to regain the control of your very being through eating. That's why any form of sensuality ends up being manifested as consuming, visually, audibly, tactile, and so on.
Trying to take in the world.
Try to repossess it, that upon which you actually depend. Which means you can only repossess the content of something, but the principle of your dependence remains completely intact. It cannot possibly change. And fully understanding that means fully understanding Paticcasamuppada. Now, how you choose to describe Paticcasamuppada and how many factors and so on, that's actually relevant, or not as relevant. The relevant is that's why the Buddha will often talk about a nutrient. Contact is the nutrient for the feeling and so on, not necessarily just the food, the physical food. He's talking about dependence, about support, about simultaneously being determined as you are by something that you're not.
Your being.
Yeah.
It's determined by the body that just.
Well, the functioning body is just a completely always has to be present, and it's completely inseparable from it, and you have no say in it. You have no say in its dependence on further food and so on. Yet your whole life stands upon it. So that's not something you have to you can only figure out once. You have to keep drilling and repeating those contemplations. Because through doing that, you keep removing layer by layer of that you created through ignoring.
Thinking, for example, the body is mine. This body is.
Yeah, the body is mine, and the body eats food.
Taking a step.
Yeah, that's it. I am eating the food.
Too far.
I have the food. I don't have the food. That's why many people would be so afraid to just go hungry even for a day. You start experiencing genuine anxiety. Just not that you're starving, but just for missing a dinner, for example.
That's all assumption. It's like the consumption of the world, consuming the world.
Yeah. Well, assumption gives the range for your consumption.
Yeah.
That's why sensuality is an assumption.
And
Like,
no
this is the extent, and that's what's determined by the assumption. That's why assumption determines the bhava, determines the being. And now your consumption is sort of engagement with that extent, with that being. So you consume because you assume. Yeah, you assume that you can consume. You assume that when you eat food, you really assimilated it in you, but you didn't. That food was external to your point of view when it was on the table. And it's equally external when it's in the stomach, because the stomach and the table are on one plane and your point of view is on the other. If there is any distinction, it's that. It's not like my stomach is in and the table is outside. No, anything physical is outside, including eating food is still physical and it's outside. So your dependence on the nutriment means dependence on that external form that you require it to be present, and you have no say in it. As I said, you can be controlling all the food production and have everything and monitor your health, and you still will get sick and you will die, which means it's fundamentally you cannot have a say in it. It has its own course, it has its own domain, and it's impermeable to you and to your efforts and to your intentions.
Even taking it in you, when you start looking backwards, so to speak, there is no place that you can take it into.
No, there is no inside. That's it. That's it. Yeah. That's why for an Arahant who has fully removed the slightest traces of those assumptions, there is this conscious body left, and name and form externally. There is no more assumption of internal for him.
Is there something about where consciousness doesn't find a footing?
No, form doesn't find the footing in the consciousness. Yeah, sure. Yeah. The footed form is the internal, the assumed internal, in me. Like I am this barrier, and this is outside, and this is in me. So by having it, I'm taking it in. But when you start looking, you realize, oh, there is no external and internal. I mean, you can designate it whichever way you want, but it's how you relate to it. Usually internal, it's related to as mine, me, within me. But if you start looking at it in that dispassionate manner, correctly, in the right order, of first with your situation, within that, the dependence of that situation upon something that's simultaneously there that cannot be yours, then you start seeing there is no external and internal. There is just external and slightly less external. And no matter how far internally you look, it's equally external. As in, it pertains to the external domain. It's just closer to you, so to speak. But before, with that assumption of extent, if it passes that extent, then it's in. You created that internal dimension of mind.
So if you say your self is an external, that sense of self,
yeah, of course,
will be seen
yeah,
as an external.
And that's when it ceases to be the self. It loses that dimension of mind. It ceases to be Attavada. Because again, that's why also Attavada is the assumption of a self independent of the five aggregates, independent of the experience as a whole. You assume this greater thing that's outside of it, as in that it's all of this is within it. All of this is in me, for me, it's mine. So all of those things are really revolving around the same principle.
Like how far can you assume? You can just
endlessly, yeah.
Endlessly, and it's infinite. There's the assumption of God, a God.
Well, I mean, you can endlessly assume particular, or you can endlessly engage with your assumptions. But of course, assumptions will come within the certain domains. Assumption of sensuality, assumption of views, assumption of virtue and duty, holding on to it, and so on. Assumption of being.
Trying to consume the whole universe.
Yeah.
Trying to go as far as
yeah. Assumption is basically maintaining a view of an extent despite things within that extent proving you wrong, going otherwise, or being otherwise in nature. Like sensuality, for example, assumption of sensuality is assumption of the extent of attractive. Yet in practice, that is always contradicted by the repulsive heart of anything sensual.
By the repulsive heart.
So if you start seeing that your assumption of sensuality is inseparable from that which is repulsive, inconceivable, apart, bound up with, it ceases to be attractive. So your assumption has faded without anything being changed, so to speak. All those things still remain. They used to attract you. They used to incite you. But now that incitement and desire is gone, but all those things stay, because they were never the problem. It was you assuming a wrong extent in regard to them. You giving them the attractive being through that assumption. They were attractive because you kept assuming them as attractive, because you could not see their nutritional dependence upon that which is inherently repulsive. Physical body, food, liquids, smells, anything. Or just general impermanence and lack of control, aging, sickening, dying. Sensuality is inseparable from it. Any sensuality, even refined sensuality. Not necessarily just coarse sexuality or gluttony, but a refined sense of smell. It can even be worse for people, because if they don't see that as equally partaking to a sensual domain, they won't see where the work is. They won't see where the problem is. So assumption, by its definition, means taking up for granted. So this has appeared seemingly attractive, and you just took it at a face value and then started pushing that extent of attractive, well, infinitely. But then if you start to reverse engineer it while it's present, start seeing what's behind it that keeps determining the extent of your assumption, you realize it's the repulsive. It's that which I cannot control, I cannot say in it. No amount of beauty can be independent of the material form being present there. And as such, that material form is completely subjected to elements and everything else that you can't even conceive accessing and controlling, let alone having as yours. And it's simply by not thinking about that, you maintain the assumption of sensuality and that whole extent, proliferating extent. If you start thinking about it, that's how you start draining those unwholesome floods, the asavas. You don't just shut off and suddenly stops. You just have to find the source and then drain it from the source. Dry it up, and then it will evaporate everywhere else.
and trying to, or assuming something that's beyond everything that you see, say consciousness or the great knower or God, as I said before. It's just a way of trying to gain ultimate control over.
It is. That's usually the people's views of God is just the extension of their own self.
Or
the self-mastery of everything, including yourself. Yeah.
Even through science, trying to find the hidden principle, the hidden
science.
matter.
It's basically a new religion for many people. It's this externally adopted view that you cannot have from your point of view. You can only keep assuming it as something that you can have. That's why the upadana of the views, the assumptions of the views.
Because some meditators are focusing in on trying to minute,
catch the right moment, or witness the atoms and stuff. It's a completely the wrong direction.
It's the same thing, isn't it? They're trying to find.
If anything, you want, if you want to focus on anything, it should be the background of what's present. But you could see you can't focus on that in the same sense that you used to focus on. You can't concentrate on that as one point. You know, when the Suttas talk about one-pointedness, people usually assume is that you get so absorbed in one point that everything else stops bothering you. But it's completely the other way around. You step back into such a general point that everything is included within it, so nothing can bother you.
Be disenchanted from.
That's why again, like what's in common to everything that you can, for example, see visually or experience through senses? Well, it's the four great elements. So that's what they call great elements, not because they're particular elements you observe through a microscope, but because you discern the principle of those elements in everything that can appear. If your mind gets established upon the principle of those elements, means you have surmounted anything that's particularly containing that principle. In the same sense, the Buddha would say, upon the greater perceptions of the forest, you abandon perceptions of the village. Then you realize, well, I can't be bothered by anything from the village because my mind is established upon this perception of the forest, even when you're not in the forest. But then I can be bothered upon the things that can arise in the forest, upon those perceptions. So then he would go further and establish his mind even in a greater background of that. And what's the greater background of village, forest? It's the earth. It's the element of earth. Then he establishes mindfulness on that refined background. I mean, you can see how general that is, that for most people it's completely abstract. It makes no sense. Yet for a trained mind, he can perceive it on that abstract level, and that means it's not abstract anymore. It's perceived right and there and then, because it is present in that general sense. And if the mind gets established upon that, means nothing can bother you, even on account of the perceptions of the forest, let alone those even more inferior perceptions. That's why when the Buddha was talking about the Kasinas, it was exactly that same principle, or jhanas for that matter. You establish your mind upon the greater domain, so that the inferior domain cannot overcome you, cannot bother you anymore. So the Kasinas will be the four great elements. And any of them can serve. Doesn't mean you have to go 1, 2, 3. You take any of it, depending like how capable your mind is, and if you establish your mind upon that right order in terms of their general and more particular things within it, you have surmounted it. And that's what the Buddha would say, like now that the mind is established upon the element of earth, nothing inferior to it can bother me. And then, oh, is there more? Can I go even higher? Oh, I can. Then he refines the element, then he goes into the perceptions of colors and light and so on, then the infinite space, and then eventually the Kasina of consciousness, which is like the most refined, the utmost background, the utmost general. And he says there is no higher than this.
That's what the Kasina of consciousness.
It's the ultimate background, so to speak. But again, if you say, oh, it's the ultimate background, well, that's now a clearly defined phenomena, a thought, Dhamma in your mind, which means that's not what consciousness is. Being aware of the background to the full extent in regard to whatever has appeared, that's how you develop the Kasina of consciousness.
Appearance.
Being aware of the background without falling into losing mindfulness on account of being pulled and absorbed into particular. That's why I would always sort of point out how, like, commonly what people think meditation is in terms of view and absorption, it's a completely wrong direction. You need to be looking at the background of what's simultaneously present, not keep trying to catch the right moment within what's within what's present right in front of you. That all comes from that projection that you can witness something outside of yourself. Well, whatever you're witnessing, that's your perception, which means it doesn't matter how far or near you come, perception is there, and you're not seeing its nature. That's why we talk about the nature of the five aggregates to be understood, not the particular content that you have to chase down and catch and document and witness. They will then do the work for you.
So, in terms of Nama Rupa, the nutriment for Nama Rupa is consciousness.
Right. Yeah. The nutriment for Nama Rupa is consciousness, as in the nutriment for something to appear is the fact that it can appear, and the nutriment for consciousness is Nama Rupa, as in order for something to appear, there has to be something that's that can appear. So that's why the Nama Rupa determined by consciousness, consciousness determined by Nama Rupa. Because if there is nothing to appear, you can't even conceive any slightest notion of appearance. So that's why there is no consciousness, or pure awareness, or pure presence in itself. There has to be something that is present. That's why fundamentally Rupa and Vijnana, or Nama Rupa and Vijnana, Vijnana and Nama Rupa.
Yes.
And you don't have to go further than that either. That's why in that Digha Nikaya Sutta, I can't remember the number, one of the previous Buddha, the Buddha Vipassana, was when he was discerning the principle of Paticcasamuppada, he did not go to the usual description that we know of 12 factors. He stopped. He said, what's determined by what determines Nama Rupa? Oh, it's Vijnana. Usually, then he will go further. What determines Vijnana? Oh, it's Sankhara. What determines Sankhara? Oh, it's ignorance of Sankhara. And that's it. But the Buddha Vipassana said, what determines Nama Rupa? Vijnana. And what determines Vijnana? Oh, it's Nama Rupa. That's it. Either way, he cannot own it. Either way, he cannot take possession of that. So if he looks at Vijnana, it's determined by Nama Rupa, so to speak. If he looks at Nama Rupa, it's determined by Vijnana, so to speak. It's always outside of his reach, the determination. Thus, he fully understood the principle of the determination, the principle of Paticcasamuppada, the principle of depending upon something that it's outside of your reach. And that's how you remove the notion of ownership, which is a notion of reach. And then he said that he just spent his time then contemplating manifestations of the five aggregates through that principle of being fully determined by that which is outside of his reach, and he became Sambuddha, completely enlightened. So that's why it always comes down to that principle. And that's the difference as well. Like the sutta you read, where you said the first nutriment, you understand one, or you understand the dyad, or you understand the three. It's exactly that difference that Buddha Vipassana didn't go to understanding the one. He came to the dyad, he understood the principle of Paticcasamuppada based on it, he contemplated it, developed it, seen it through and through, and became Sambuddha. Buddha Gautama was the foremost in formulating the Dhamma, which means he was able to discern it up to the fullest. So that's why he would formulate the principle of Paticcasamuppada in all like 12 factors as we know it. But it wasn't a rigid thing, because there's a different ways you can describe the same principle. That's why in some other suttas he will be describing Paticcasamuppada in 16 factors. But after feelings and craving, people take up guns and sticks and fight and so on. And it was part of the Paticcasamuppada. So don't think about it as some sort of determinational chain. Think about it as a principle of simultaneous presence and dependence upon something that you cannot have. And that's why it directly undermines the sense of ownership. You don't have to, the Buddha Vipassana or whoever practices, contemplates correctly, he doesn't have to sit back and afterwards and then think, how does that prevent me from taking things as mine? Understanding that your sense of self, your entirety of your experience, is determined by that which you cannot have on the same level of that experience. If you look at that, then it's determined by the other thing. So it's always opposite of where you look. Hence I keep talking about development of mindfulness, development of samadhis through discernment of the background, establishment of your mind upon the background, because that's where determination is. You can't make a determination in front of you and examine it on the same level, because that something else is the background, which means something else determines that which you're looking at. So you have to cease being focused and concerned with the content, and start discerning the nature, the background, the more general. Hence the Buddha named the entire teaching as the nature. There are all these particular Dhammas, and my teaching is understanding of their nature, understanding of the Dhamma.